It feels fantastic. The University of the Arts London is obviously a very special organisation. It crosses London, very close to Tate, adjacent to Tate Britain. I adore Camberwell as part of my youth. Many visits, many classes. So for me, it's, and I never went to art school, so that it has a particular kind of poignancy that I'd like to think this is my chance at, being involved in an art school.
Yeah.
And one of the great art schools of the world. So many of the artists that I studied, admire, studied at one or other of the colleges embraced in the University of the Arts. How did it come about? By mistake, really. I never really thought I would be director, and I sort of not exactly given up hope. I'd sort of made a pact with myself that to be the director of the collection and to do great exhibitions was really quite sufficient in my life, and to have a kind of, array of chuck some balls in the air in terms of hobbies. I love to do other things beyond work. And then when my predecessor resigned, I just realised there's a sort of like revelation that I just didn't want to work for another director. It was just like, that's enough. Because there's something particularly challenging about middle management, when you never really get your head above the parapet. So I took a deep breath and went for it, and I have to say it was absolutely the right decision, because I've just enjoyed every day since.
Were you ever tempted to create objects of your own?
Yeah, I was definitely going to be an artist. Like many young people, I loved art. The rotring pen was my favourite instrument as a child, and I loved drawing in sepia ink. And for a long time, I thought I would be an artist. I had one of those conversations with my art teacher when I was in my late teens, about. I sort of plucked up courage to ask whether she thought I would be a good artist, or dare I say great artist. And she was incredibly honest with me. She said she couldn't guarantee that I would be a great artist. And so I could have flipped at that stage and decided that, if I couldn't be a great artist, I wouldn't be an artist at all. And actually, in some ways, I regret that decision, because I think that I studied art at a time when art history was very much about a particular kind of canonical and almost the straitjacket of modernism. So I just learnt about painting and a particular kind of studio practice. And of course, had I been more aware of, the reality and breadth of contemporary art as at that time when I was growing up as a student, I think I would have been fantastically excited about conceptual art and the possibility of working with a camera and film and video. So that was an example. Although I had wonderful relationships with my teachers, it was a misguided piece of advice. Having said that, it took me in the direction of history and art history, and I found a lot of creativity in those subjects.
And do you think, in a way, ending up somewhere like the Tate Modern is a bit of a rebellion against that sort of...
I don't like the idea of ending up. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I have always felt that that one should transgress the borders. Probably because of that advice and because of taking it, I've been very aware subsequently that whatever anybody tells you, push a little bit further. It's always worth opening the next door, or looking around the corner, or following your instincts, because often the most generative and creative and dynamic things actually are on the margins. You know, the mushrooms grow on the edge of the forest.
Yeah.
The great things are washed up by the sea. It's a classic, you know, the metaphors for the way things, you know, exciting things happen slightly out of view very often. When should I begin?
From the beginning.
I don't think I had many school highlights, which is interesting. I wasn't such a great school student, but I kind of knuckled down in my later years at school, and I got a scholarship to Cambridge, and that was like, I didn't even know what a scholarship to Cambridge was, so that's probably the biggest highlight of my life in a way, because I suddenly thought, I can do it, I could do something, you know, how amazing. I could be somebody. So that was great. And then I had some academic successes at university, which were gratifying. But I think my career highlights have been the big exhibitions that I've done. So let's face it, you know, Louise Bourgeois, Yayoi Kusama, Agnes Martin, Alberto Giacometti just opened. And then I suppose less visible highlights, like writing, you know, about artists that I'm passionate about. Villa de Barlow, for example, it's my most exciting piece of writing that I ever did. I loved writing about her work and the experience. And then beyond me, of course, I'm most proud to be associated with the opening of Tate Modern. We opened last year with a vision that I am absolutely behind and helped shape, which is to do with diversity and a broad international agenda. It's a place where you don't need a visa to walk between Beijing and, you know, Berlin. I'm passionate about making that borderlessness, a borderlessness that to transgress other borders of medium, gender, ethnicity, so that we can look at celebrate the whole range of creativity. Beyond that, I want to make this a place that really is a local museum, like my National Maritime Museum was, where local people, particularly young people, feel is a very natural and friendly place for them to visit. And we will be doing that in association with local communities and local schools, so that we can really commit to building that kind of engagement, which isn't just once in a child's school career, but is every year.
Yes.
So to do that at the same time as we grow as one of the world's great contemporary art museums. They might be surprised to learn that I'm happily married and have 3 children, and that that's an important part of my life. I think they might be surprised to know that I still really care about making exhibitions, and I don't just want to be a bureaucratic director. I want to be somebody who is very hands-on and works with artists. I think they might be surprised that I care about the whole of Tate Modern. I really care about the food in the restaurant, and the knives and the forks on the table, and the books in the bookshop, and I want to make sure those can be as good as they can be. You know, it's interesting, when my first visits to the Tate all those years ago as a teenager, or even before, Tate was a hallowed place to see paintings in frames on the walls, and occasionally to see some sculpture too, but it was a place where you talked in a whisper, and you could hear your feet echo, and once you'd seen and thought and reflected, you left. And I would love the Tate to be a place that you hang out and you can hear music, you can have a bite to eat, you can meet your friends, you can, you know, see great art, but in the context of living life.
I love those 24-hour openings that you do before some of the Blockbuster exhibitions shut. I know quite a few of our Vanity Fair team came down at sort of 3 in the morning. And
well, expect more of that over the coming years.
That would be really fun.
I was very lucky because at the end of my street in South East London was the National Maritime Museum, and it was a magical place for children. It was very old-fashioned, difficult to remember nowadays, but museums used not to have labels, and moving images. It was full of dusty showcases with little mock-ups of battles, and I loved the artefacts, and I loved that it was a place that you could play. It was a very democratic open space, and there were a number of images there that were very kind of compelling, almost iconic images in my life as a child, particularly the great painting of the death of Nelson, and this emaciated white body portrayed in a down below on the Victory, and it was for me it was my kind of first experience of death, was this depiction of Nelson's death, and the famous words "kiss me hardy" were very curious and provocative words for me. And the other thing I loved at that museum, which has stayed with me, and I think was in a quite formative. It wasn't just the painting. I loved Nelson's naval uniform, and it had a bullet hole in the shoulder. So again, it was like a tangible evidence of history. And then there were a pair of very beautiful ancient white breeches that Nelson had worn that were blood-stained, and the blood was long, for many years had not been red, so it's sort of brown kind of stuff. And so I think partly it accounts for why I felt very drawn to history, and why I've always felt that objects have a very potent emotive quality and can kind of act as metaphors in our lives. But of course the other museum I loved was the Bethnal Green Museum of Childhood.
Okay.
The dolls' houses were a paradise for me as a child, and as I grew taller I could see more further up into these fantastic old dolls' houses. And you were talking about Philida Barlow, wonderful conversations with Philida about attics and secrets and lives and behind closed doors. So the domestic environment, and again the power of domestic objects to speak about people's lives, has often informed my interest in artists. Louise Bourgeois, for example, the home, the femme maison, the housewife.
And one of the other things I wanted to ask you is around just education generally, as I know that you've been quite outspoken on the sort of need for strong visual arts education. I just wondered if you could explain a bit about that, and especially in state schools, and why that's so important.
Well, I think visual arts education has obviously been squeezed in state schools over the last decade or so, but I would argue that visual arts and creativity are as key as any of those, kind of inescapably part of education from the beginning right through, because visual arts arts in general are the area where children can most easily demonstrate and access creativity, and creativity is the great driver. One of the earliest words children ask is why, and another word is how, and the why and the how are questions that are so easily explored through the eye and the hand in creative activities. And I think it's a huge benefit to everything that young people go on to do.
I think it's especially true because when I think back to when I was at school, like 2000, 2007, the art department was just somewhere where people who were talented, who could draw or paint went. I didn't even know that history of art was a thing that one could really do.
Yeah.
And I think you're so right, it is really important to sort of push that side of things. And so I'm just trying to...
There's another thing. I think it is also in a world where we're in a school world where you're increasingly driven to perform standardised tests in standardised ways, in standardised classes. Visual arts is the place, one of the few places where you can genuinely be uniquely yourself. And there are no rules, and there's not necessarily early on good or bad. So you can have real ownership of your mind, and real control of what happens between your mind and your eye and your hand. And I think that's incredibly important. My very first major exhibition I made at the old Tate Gallery in 1993, and it was called Paris Postwar. And I was thrilled to have the opportunity, and it took 3 years of my life to put together. It was a major, major project. And at the opening, everybody was extremely, excited and delighted, and I was really pleased with the show. And then I woke up on the Sunday morning, and my husband threw the papers onto the bed, and I started reading them with growing concern and upset because the show was panned. And I'm going to say I've never really recovered from that. It's made me very cautious about press response. It's made me more resilient about bad response, but it's made me, I do breathe a sigh of relief when I get 4 stars or 5 stars. If I get a few 4 stars and 5 stars, I don't mind getting a few very critical comments. In one sense, it doesn't matter at all. But, you know, my parents read the papers and I don't want to upset them. And also, frankly, I have to be very, very cautious of ticket sales. So it's a tremendous boost to the organisation, to everybody when they think we've got a success on our hands.
Yeah. I think it's also the worst when you read a review and you just think that's really unfair. Like sometimes when you read like critical reviews, and the same with restaurants, and I just think, you know, that's just not
You have to
fair.
take it on the chin and walk away and be robust. And that's actually when your circle of old friends come into play, because they're the ones who know you and who are honest with you and will say, well, you know, that's how it goes.
I think that's again really good advice for the students as well, because I think you're most fragile when you leave university.
But then the other thing that they must remember is what I realise is that you know, you can do what is seen as a disaster or something that's, you know, you can make a mistake. I mean, Tate Modern, when we opened in 2000, many of the critics thought we just, like it was, you know, what we'd done with the collection was a disaster. Just wait a few years and it turns itself around. And often when you break out and you do something differently or surprising or unexpected, people won't like it. People, you know, most critics want to be reassured about what's familiar to them. So it's difficult for them to accept change. It's difficult for anybody to change their minds. But with the passage of time, a show that was a disaster 10 years ago then can be seen as a triumph or a really groundbreaking exercise.
Yes.
And certainly that happened with my exhibition, Paris Postwar. And there was a brief moment when, you know, the catalogues were selling on eBay for £300 a piece.
Wow.
And I think, you know, likewise, the opening of Tate Modern in 2000 is now regarded as an absolute landmark moment in the history of museums.